Welcome everybody to the SNF Rendez-vous de l'Institut, the Fellows Series. Tonight we give the stage to Hiba Bou Akar, Associate Professor in the Urban Planning Program at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. Hiba's research focuses on planning in conflict and post-conflict cities, the question of urban security and violence, and the role of religious political organizations in the making and remaking of cities. At GSAPP, Hiba leads the Post-Conflict Cities Lab. The lab was created to focus on post-conflict urban planning and engage in research on the ways in which planning practice in contested cities has been simultaneously a tool of pacification, conflict, and development. Hiba also works with NGOs as an architect and planner. Her first book, For the War Yet to Come, Planning's Beirut's Frontiers, won the Nikki Keddie Book Award and the Anthony Leeds Prize in 2019, and is a groundbreaking study in understanding how we shape and rebuild cities and the cities whose shape are divides. This book has been of considerable interest not only in the field of architecture and urban planning, but also in sociology, anthropology, politics, and economics. Hiba is also a wonderful storyteller, as you will see in the short film she will be showing you today. She writes in accessible prose and makes complex and layered scholarship relatable through her great empathy for the people whose lives are shaped and destroyed by war, displacement, and planning practices on the ground. She's currently working on Sedimentary Urbanization, an ethnographic and archival book project investigating how low-income Lebanese families and Syrian refugees access affordable housing in Beirut's peripheries, living together in friction and in abject and precarious conditions where urban inequality causes more forms of violence. Hiba refers to these places as dead futures, where any perspective is interrupted by war, economic crisis, or environmental disaster. How do you plan in cities where the future, and now the present, is a succession of crises and wars? With close to 1.5 million refugees, Lebanon, which is a very small country, Hiba's home country, has been transformed by these movements of people where temporary refugee accommodations have become permanent over the years, hardening into urban landscape in perpetual collapse. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Mary, for the amazing introduction. And I also like to express my sincere gratitude for everyone who is part of the Institute here, for the Institute for Ideas and Imagination, for having us here, for being an amazing place to think with people, to meet amazing people, and for the funders of this incredible opportunity. I'm really grateful. So as you may know, and as Mary already said a little bit in her introduction, tonight's talk focuses on war and displacement in Lebanon. I'm from Lebanon, and so while I'll briefly touch on what you guys are all seeing on your screens at the moment, the bombing of Beirut and Lebanon by Israel, my work covers earlier phases of war and displacement. Lebanon's cycles of war, destruction, death, and displacement have been set in motion many decades ago, so you're just seeing a new iteration, a new phase of that. And my work excavates these earlier itineraries of displacement and post-war urbanization. So tonight I'll do two things. I will first discuss my last book and how it's related to what's going on right now for the war yet to come. I will then introduce my current book that I'm working on this year here. I will, however, be happy to answer any questions you might have about the current situation and how it relates to the themes of this work, whatever is going on in Lebanon, to the extent of what I can, and during Q&A. For the war yet to come, planning Beirut's frontiers. One day, while I was listening to a popular Lebanese radio show discussing the challenges currently facing Beirut, the show's host at some point said, and I quote, "I think we should all start thinking about urban planning. Look around you. In this city, planning lacks planning and order. This was not the first time that I heard such a statement. During my fieldwork for this first book, I would often get the same reaction. You went all the way to the United States and came back to Beirut to study urban planning. Does planning even exist in this city? For my interlocutors who had experienced a 15-year civil war between 1975 and 1990, planning promised a better future, a future of well-being. However, many years later, in a region continuously rocked with violence and millions of refugees, where war always looms on the horizon, planning has yet to deliver on that promise. As someone who lived through the Lebanese civil war, these feelings were also personal. In the 1980s, my family and I experienced firsthand the geographies of war, including multiple forced displacements. Today, wars and the fear of future wars continue to shape our everyday life and my family's everyday life who continue to live in Lebanon. But so do promises of a better future of post-wars that are always expected yet to come. Throughout my work, I chose to write about violence, or I choose to write about violence in a place I call home, itself the landscapes of many lost homes, making this a quest that has been shaped by my personal history as much as it is a scholarly inquiry into geographies of conflict and their aftermath. To this end, I examine in the war yet to come the underlying logics that make phrases such as planning lacks planning and order a common sentiment in Beirut. And I show how a deep feeling develops when the specters of wars are always present, when state structures are not clear, and when public projects are often outsourced and privatized. However, I argue that such conditions, and it might be hard to convince you right now at this moment while you're seeing on whatever you're seeing on your screens, I argue that such conditions are neither exceptional nor restricted to the paradigm of cities in conflict like Beirut, Belfast, and Medellin. Assuming these cities are exceptional reproduces the same assumption that this work seeks to destabilize. These assumptions are mostly rooted on how we imagine the future and the temporalities of planning and development interventions. So indeed, for so long, the intertwined feelings of planning and development and architecture to a certain extent have been configured with an imagined future of progress. Somehow that if you plan, if you manage resources, that somehow the future is going to be better. However, today we are at a global moment in which the imagined future in most places in the world, not only in Beirut and in Gaza and Belfast in Medellin, but in also cities of the global north, is one of context and contestation, characterized by ecological crises, by anticipated terror attacks, unprecedented influx of refugees and migrants, a horizon of what I call in my first book, The War Yet to Come. Taking as my case study post-war civil Lebanon, I argue that Beirut's peripheries tell us a much different story about planning and its temporalities. And this is a very different story. So these are the southern peripheries of Beirut. You're seeing a lot of videos from them these days. And this is a very different story from the one usually told about Beirut seen through the prism of its downtown post-war reconstruction project following the end of the civil war in 1990. Characterized basically by neat, colorful master plans, glittering buildings, but mostly emptied out streets. In contrast, Beirut's fast urbanizing peripheries suddenly emerged in 2008 as frontiers of renewed sectarian conflict, when dozens were killed in an episode of violence that was a reminder of the civil war. I argue that this transformation of peripheries into frontiers could be understood through the spatial and the temporal logic of the war yet to come. And so the war yet to come does not treat war and peace as distinct categories, which is what we usually people assume that the peace is the absence of war. It doesn't approach war as a temporal aberration in a linear time of progress with a beginning and an end, but rather it focuses how in places like Beirut, war, violence, and their anticipation have shaped the city's segregated geographies over time. And the logic of the war yet to come has a temporal and a spatial dimension. So temporally, the war yet to come reconfigures the temporalities of the yet to, of what we expect of the future. It provides a different lens than the yet to of modernization that assumes that there's always the future is going to be better, and we assume that about our own lives as well, that we go to school to improve in life, we do this to improve in life. So there's always these assumptions that the future is going to be better, which is the modernist idea of the future that is premised on a belief, the ability to forecast the future, to manage territories towards progress, which is to this day guides most planning and development practice. The future of the war yet to come instead is uncertain and volatile, and this affects how geographies and their futures are being shaped, contested, and negotiated. Spatially, in times of peace, this war is often not a war of tanks, cannons, and rifles and bombs, but is fundamentally a geopolitical territorial conflict where the fear of domination of one group by another is fought first and foremost over land and apartment sales, over real estate, through zoning, planning, and infrastructure projects. The outcomes are planned spaces that are low income, have overlapping industrial and residential zones, where highways are never finished, and playgrounds are never built. These are what I call the geographies of the war yet to come. In Lebanon, it's the former civil war militias who are key to shaping these geographies. Since the end of the civil war, these militias have become major religious political organizations. They're the main political parties. And basically, they are the primary spatial and development actors in the country who challenge our understanding of geographic production because they operate simultaneously inside and outside the government. In my first book, and this is also important for when we talk later in Q&A, so the same actors are the government and outside the government. And therefore, when you hear in the news that these actors are outside the government, that they created the spaces outside the rest of the city, this is already problematic because the same actors, including Hezbollah, are inside the government and outside it at the same time. So in my first book, the four actors I focus on are the Shia Hezbollah, the Sunni Future Movement, the Druze Progressive Socialist Party, PSP. For those who are unfamiliar with the Druze, they're a minority religious group in the Middle East. And the Maronite Christian Church, which is of course not a militia, but it has Christian militias associated with it. These four groups were the most present on the ground in the southern peripheral areas, continue to be, where I've been conducting most of my research. So to understand how planning is actually practiced on the ground, I conducted an ethnography of spatial practices in three southern peripheries of Beirut, namely Haima, Dimar Mkhail, Sahra Shwaifet, and Dawhat Aramoun. As you can see on the map, these areas are peripheries of not only municipal Beirut, but also but also the southern suburbs of Beirut. So you can see here, these areas are not, this pointer doesn't work here, but they are not only peripheries of municipal Beirut, but also the southern suburbs of Beirut that you hear of as Ad-Dahi. From my research in these sites, three peripheral spatial and temporal renses of urban growth emerged, namely doubleness, lacework, and ballooning. Conceptually, these three processes reveal how planning and space making in post-conflict cities mold space and time in labyrinth ways, in contrast to these teleological assumptions about growth characterized, for example, by this expectation of a concentric model of urban growth that assigns degrees of urbanization as you go out of the cities to the rural areas or villages outside cities. So one of the sites is Haima Dimar Mkhail. The neighborhood closest to Beirut and Ad-Dahi was predominantly a Christian neighborhood before the civil war. Its post-conflict geography can be understood through what I call the doubleness of ruins. In 2004, when I first started visiting these areas, the streets were buzzing with life, children playing, elderly congregating amidst sounds coming from the busy light industries in the area. The neighborhood's war-scarred building, bombed and abandoned during the Civil War, had been transformed into makeshift homes for families that were displaced in 1975 from South Lebanon. You can see, for example, if you look closely at the buildings, you can see more recent concrete blocks. So people actually built housing, and right now this is repeating itself. People built houses inside bomb buildings and lived there for close to 30 years. Many families who I spoke to had been living in the area for 30 years, and they were awaiting post-war government compensation to leave. When I returned in 2009, the area felt like a ghost town. War-displaced families had been evicted, ruins stood empty, new fancy yet empty buildings dotted the landscape, with apartments selling upward of $350,000. So it was a checkered geographies of ruins and new construction. And when I asked about why some buildings were still in ruins while many others have been demolished and replaced, I learned that the church had stopped the sale and development of these places. My investigation into this checkered geographies of ruins and construction shows how the area have become one of the major contested frontiers in times of peace, where the Christians and Shias are struggling over land. And they basically do that through the Maronite Church on the Christian side and Hezbollah-affiliated real estate developers on the Shia side. So if the ruins stayed intact, the land was bought by the church. If it was replaced, the land was being developed by a Shia developer. On the local level, this territorial war is conducted through channeling real estate markets, changing land policies, modifying building and zoning laws. Internationally, it unfolds through global networks of finance, fundraising, religious allegiances in Sao Paulo, in Sydney, in Washington, D.C. And for example, church affiliates on the local level are trying to change preemption law in land sales to expand the right of first refusal to the Christian community. So let me explain that. The right of first refusal in real estate usually is that if you're selling a land, you have to ask your neighbors if they want to buy the land first before you can sell it to a stranger. And usually it's just the neighbor. And so there's all these attempts to try to change the idea of a neighbor to the Christian community writ large. So you can ask the Christian community, not just your immediate neighbor, for buying this land, to keep the land as Christian or to leave the land as Druze, whatever the community we're talking about. So Shia developers are referring to DC, Sydney, and Sao Paulo to buy land in High Madi from landowners who immigrated during the Civil War and never returned. The church, on the other hand, is trying to overturn these real estate transactions. Public officials are changing the zoning and building laws to make the investment for Shia developers unprofitable. Local municipalities are prohibiting land sales between Christian and Muslims. So, for example, this is a poster from a few years back that says from Al-Hadas, which was also bombed recently. It says for the billboard flyer from Al-Hadas, a neighboring municipality of Haimadi, says for Al-Hadas to remain for its people, don't sell your land, don't sell your house, the municipality will not sign your paperwork, which is let's keep Hadas Christians and please don't sell or rent for Muslims in the area. In this contested geographies, civil war ruins are So basically, in this contested geography, civil war ruins are the ruins of a contested past of the Civil War, as much as they are ruins in contested presence and future over these transactions. So leftover ruins are indicators of an ongoing territorial war that's not so different from the Civil War. And this critical excavation exercise of ruins shows how the contradiction and crisis that we assume between these boundaries of between what is war, what is peace, what is future, what's past, progress and violence, construction and destruction, and even what is home, what is displacement, and what is segregation, and what is coexistence. Many of the war-displaced families in High Madi Mar Mikhail eventually moved to Sahra Shwayfit, my second site, after receiving monetary compensation. Sahra Shwayfit is located next to the Beirut International Airport and is a second-tier periphery of Beirut and Al-Dahi. During the Civil War, the area was an agricultural land heavily guarded by its Druze landowners. The two main warring factions in the area are the Shia Hezbollah and the Druze-affiliated PSP. After the end of the Civil War, with pressure of urbanization from Al-Dahi, massive low-cost housing projects starting mushrooming in the area. Okay, and I want you to remember a little bit this image because I'm going to come back to it at the end. So massive low-cost housing projects started mushrooming in the area, which eventually housed many of the Shia war-displaced families. They were mostly Hezbollah as supporters because they had to be, to a certain extent, to be able to access these affordable housing units. The real estate developers were also Hezbollah affiliates who were financially supported to provide low-cost housing in the area. These massive developments did not go unnoticed by the municipality, which was affiliated with this PSP. These are like on the heels of a civil war where people were killed by the parties. So people were very aware of what's going on in terms of the sectarian making of the territory. In order to stop the urbanization of the area as a Shia territory, the PSP, through its different positions inside and outside the government, worked towards zoning the area as industrial. At the same time, Hezbollah worked to zone it as residential. As political alliances ebbed and flowed between the two groups, zoning and building laws kept changing. So between 1996 and 2008, for example, the master plan and zoning of Sahra Shwayfit changed 8 times in 12 years. So here the red is industrial and the green and blue are residential. And you can see just from this example how they continue to change between what is residential and what's what is industrial. In Sahra Shwayfit, as one planner told me, industrial zone is synonym for Druze territory and residential zone is a synonym for the Shia territory. Between industrial and residential areas, Sahra Shwayfit has become a patchwork of apartment buildings in the vicinity of industries and an active urban agriculture area. Every winter, the area witnesses an environmental disaster when rainwater gets mixed with industrial waste and soil filling up the residential streets. In 2008, as sectarian battles raged in the street of Sahra Shwayfit, another battle took place over another zoning reiteration. The PSP passed a master plan that reinscribes the area as middle income to slow its urbanization. So For example, if you look at this table, you can see how the 2004 allowed for hollow concrete facades and for corrugated tin sheets. In architecture and urban planning speak, this is read as low income, right? So hollow concrete, tin sheets. However, the 2008 law imposed extensive stone cladding and red tile roofing. So in 2008 zoning, it asked for facades to be cladded with 60% natural stone. That's very expensive. 60% of the roof should be covered with red tiles, very, very expensive. And then it prohibited to have more than 2 apartments per floor, basically increasing very exponentially the size of the apartment and the cost of the apartment that are possible in the area. This rezoning is not only related to these actors positioning in local wars, but also regional ones, which are we seeing right now. Sahra Shweifet was bombed in the July 2006 Israel's war on Lebanon and was targeted by ISIS in 2014 by a suicide bomber, inserting Beirut's peripheries as a node in the Arab, Israeli, and Sunni Shia regional conflict in the Middle East. And I will circle back at the end of this talk to discuss the positionality of Sahra Shweifet in the current war that's currently unfolding. Therefore, military geographies are also key to these rezoning schemes, since both actors function as paramilitaries with expected roles in local and regional wars yet to come and the wars that arrived. Therefore, paramilitary urban strategies like domination of hilltops, like access to weapons through the airport, are key to these planned geographies. For example, the contestation over industrial residential zoning has also to do with the ability to connect to the airport. Also, PSP's rezoning of hilltops as villa zones aim to stop urbanization on military strategic hills. So, for example, if you look here, this is the same master plan. This area was D. In the Lebanese urban planning zoning law, D is a high-dense residential and commercial area. They worked really hard to change it to V, which is an invented category of V as in villas, which in the US are referred to as single-family homes. And therefore, you can imagine how much less dense the area is and who is allowed to build there, much richer folks. These planning practices have now created a lacework of urbanization that folds areas for housing into industrial and agricultural zones, mixed areas controlled by Shias with one controlled by Druze, and delineates new contours of sectarian violence and engagement that keeps changing as the alliances ebb and flow between these factions. Not very far from Sahra Shweifet is Dawhat Aramoun, the furthest of the 3 sites from Beirut and Al-Dahiya. Its urban development is characterized by a mixture of lavishness and extreme poverty, of spectacular views of the Mediterranean Sea, and of garbage filling its 3 streams. This is where I lived for after the war, for most of my life, before going to the US to study. This was a result of how the area has ballooned over time, without much regulation, to a dense periphery for Sunni families undergoing gentrification by post-war reconstruction from Dam Beirut, and some of the Druze families, one of them is my family, that continued to live in that area after the war, that moved to live in that area after the war. The Sunni Future Movement, which controlled the government after the civil war, supported this transformation by investing in large-scale capital planning projects, supported by international aid and loans from Qatar, from Saudi Arabia, from Kuwait, you name it, to upgrade the area through highways and infrastructure, an area that also emerged in 2008 as a new battleground, sectarian battleground. And I will talk more about Dawhat Aramoun in a minute. Together, these case studies show that the failure of Beirut new peripheral development to provide residents with safe environments is not about the failure of planning that is assumed by Rima and many people that planning lacks planning and order, or the way such spaces might defy the logic of planning, like these people in the global south, in the Middle East, they don't know what order is, planning, etc. In fact, these peripheries are intricately planned, and the ordering of the present as we saw it instead is produced by several contested exercises over different imagined futures. Many of them contain wars and their roles in wars, rendering planning a tool of conflict as much as it is a tool of peace and order. And especially in Europe, after World War II, planning is imagined to be like, the Marshall Plan. This is like where you get peace and order, and there's this modernist idea of planning continues to be. But in many places in the world, including in New York, and I don't know much about Paris, but I know a little bit, it's also used as a tool of conflict, like with what's happening with the Berlioz, or redrawing the contours of what is a greater Paris here. In such context, planning practices involves innovative techniques to continuously balance a spatiality of political difference in order to keep a war at bay when possible, while simultaneously allowing for urban growth and development profit. As planning is evacuated of its development ideals, globally and locally, planners have increasingly become the technicians of the spatial logic of the war yet to come. Okay, so from there I will move to the current project, so from the war yet to come to sedimentary urbanization. So it is from the war yet to come's last site, Dawhat Aramoon, that I start my current project entitled Sedimentary Urbanization, Displacement, Refugees, and the New Geographies of Dead Futures. In the war yet to come, I explored how geographies are planned, how they're lived, practiced within a future imagined as foreclosed. In this project, I was hoping at least, to extend that inquiry to ask what possibilities can foreclosed futures open for new unplanned futures? How might new forms of living and shelter emerge, arrangements that were never part of the original plan? This new book centers refugees and the role of international aid organizations. So since 2011, thousands of Syrian families arrived to Beirut's peripheries seeking shelter away from the Syrian war that started in 2011. Because the Lebanese government refused to establish camps for them, thousands have settled formally and informally in Beirut's peripheries since the onset of the Syrian war. The Syrian refugees arrived to Dawhat Aramoon by following the existing networks of their family members, including those who worked as Syrian migrant laborers in the construction industry in Lebanon, decades before the Syrian war. Most of the families I have interviewed, their refugees and locals, live in poverty and crowded housing conditions. Seeking shelter outside camps, many refugees, especially the mostly economically disadvantaged, became what is known as urban refugees in international aid lingo, seeking shelter in unfinished buildings and renting rundown apartments. The category of urban refugees has proved to be a challenge for most international aid organizations who do not have, even after millions of refugees in the world have settled in urban areas, a clear idea of how to approach it, but a series of experiments responding to a range of questions, including how do you reach urban refugees if they're not like in a camp? Do you provide aid to refugees only? What do you do with the host communities? Do you provide aid to host communities? How do you address aid gaps between poor refugees and poor locals that have caused hostilities? How do you figure out who's in need, how to reach them? These are among the many questions that have shaped how the UNHCR, the United Nations High Council for Refugees, and other agencies have struggled with. In this new project, I traced the different urbanization layers of two housing modalities that became sites of refugees in Dawhat Aramoon, tracing how these residential spaces have changed over time in the wake of not one war, but several local and regional wars, as flows of displacement ebbed and flowed, as the geopolitical conditions shifted between the era of national building, civil war, after war, reconstruction, Palestinian refugees, and lately after the influx of the Syrian refugees. Sedimentation is a process of settling that is the result of multiple processes that move across space and time. Through these processes of sedimentation, new geographies emerge. This is in the mountains and whatever, in the ground that we're now currently on. Thinking of it temporally, sedimentation has a long temporal duration during which both the initial spatial configuration as well as the destination spaces, the new spaces of sedimentation, are transformed. Thus, so the beginning and the end are transformed and everything in the middle, and so there opens up for new ways for new possibilities, basically. I therefore use the concept of sedimentary urbanization to think about what one may call the new geographies of the dead futures, and I will come back to it in a second, which calls into attention the ways in which the geographies of imagined futures of the past, of what was planned, of what was legal, the building laws, the suburbanization plans, the ideas of profit, the humanitarian aid, have been reconfigured within the geographies of wars and occupation, and to become dead futures that open up the possibilities for new modes of inhabitation and existence in the city that are yet to emerge, especially for those who would not have had access to shelter otherwise. So through ethnographic and archival research and interviews that I started a few years back into these housing structures, I've interviewed resident refugees, mosque workers, municipal offices, as well as representatives from UNHCR, UNDP, the Norwegian Refugee Council, Cooperative Housing Foundation, and all the main actors that are involved in international aid in Lebanon to discuss the failures of aid fund improvements project in places like Zahra and beyond. As these agencies scouted for refugees in apartment buildings and abandoned shelters, their intervention rates from pipes, sewers, waste infrastructure to bathroom installations. And these interventions crisscross between the Lebanese and the Syrian population, exposing the connection and disjunctions between refugees and residency. And so while the tensions over permanence of refugees, their perception, planning justice have been widely discussed, the dynamic of servant provision of international aid organization to urban refugees is yet to be explored. So I've been developing the concept of sedimentary urbanization as a theoretical lens as well as an inquiry, like into how I do research, how to think about how to do research in a place that doesn't have archives, in a geographies that are transnational and international, that have so many actors in them. So I use sedimentation not only as a theoretical lens, but also as a methodological lens of inquiry. As the field got reshaped since then, since I started this, by the October 17, 2019, which is today's October 17, that was a very hopeful moment. Lebanese uprising, a global pandemic, the third most violent explosion in the world on August 4, 2020, the worst national economic crisis that has seen Lebanese lose 90% of their money and they still can't access their funds from the bank. And now we'll have to contend with Israel's new round of bombing on Lebanon. In the two housing modalities I'm examining, I excavate basically the interrelated layers of housing, war, and displacement. One is called Villa Mkahal, and the other one is a pseudonym. I call it Zahra Project. So in Villa Mkahal, the one housing modality that I'm studying involves an unfinished building that is called Villa Mkahal. Its construction has been halted at the beginning of the Lebanese Civil War in 1975. Up until recently, the unfinished villa has been informally inhabited by 28 Syrian refugee families. Through this villa, I examined 4 arrested futures that you can see, for example, the suburbanization, occupation, refugees, and the afterlife, which you can see a little bit, even if it's a little bit too literal, in this image, where you see the initial villa, where you see the occupation, the occupation layer, and then you see the refugee field, the cement blocks, and you see the pipes of the International Aid Organization, all connecting this in this one facade of a building. So basically, the first one, so this is Villa Mkahal, and this is the mosque next to it, which I'll also talk about in a second. So the first level is the suburbanization, and I will just briefly talk about these different layers of excavation. So the villa was designed during the push for suburbanization in Lebanon in 1950s. That was partially funded by the United States as part of Eisenhower's Point 4 program to combat communism in Lebanon during the Cold War. And so you see here the first time actually the US Army has stepped ground in the Middle East was actually in front of Dahat Aramoun in 1958. And the idea was then to export these kind of suburbs that were very big in the US, and to also export with them a US economy of building and designers, etc. And for those of you who don't, so these suburbia models of suburbia are called levee towns. And for those of you who don't know how much about levee towns, this is one from, the biggest one is in Pennsylvania. Here is the representation views of those post-World War II suburbs, one of the root problems of another problem, which is the climate crisis. This coincided basically with the mandate of Michel Ecochard, which is actually a very famous French planner and architect, to master plan Beirut and its suburb. That included a similar vision of suburbia that was fueled by the US basically and funded for a certain extent by that. Low-rise, dispersed forms of urbanization. And so one of the areas that became target of this kind of form of suburbanization is Dahat Aramoun. That's before the beginning of the Civil War. So Dahat Aramoun became a target of a land parcelization scheme, and you see a little bit of that levee town situation going on that aimed to reproduce a levee town of sorts for the upper income. So where the suburb was imagined to be a destination for the higher income, villas were built in the area that became home to the US ambassador in Lebanon, to the Egyptian ambassador. It was the most foreign dignitaries lived in Dahat Aramoun, as well as the head of the Lebanese parliament and other Lebanese wealthy families that I've interviewed. Within the onset of the Civil War, these utopic planning projects of the suburbs in Lebanon, dreams were all halted and they became dead. This is an aerial view before the crazy mass urbanization of Dahat Aramoun with the end of the Civil War. The other layer that I'm working on is the occupation during the Civil War by the Syrian armed forces. So that is the earlier phase than the Syrian refugees. And so it was after the arrested future of westernized suburbia, Syrian armed forces occupied strategic areas in and around Beirut and other parts of Lebanon. And they moved actually to Villa Mkahal that you just saw and other surrounding buildings, transforming them into nodes into a transnational geography of military occupation until the Syrian army was forced out of Lebanon in 2005. And the Syrian armed forces confiscated many villas, including Mkahal, to establish their military stations. And I personally lived next to Mkahal for like 15 years. And I can talk more about this. And so this location acted as nodes in a flow of information, weaponry, control, and imprisonment that went on around Beirut. These are some of the pictures that a Canadian photographer took of after the Syrian army left these villas, including Kahal and the graffiti that they left in the buildings. So the Syrian armed forces actually played a big role in that kind of urbanization of Dawhat Aramun. They became the de facto rulers on the ground. They condoned extra legal construction in exchange for apartments, money, and services. And they put in motion a frenzied pace of illegalized urbanization that became into high-rise buildings that affected the airport and forced the airport to change its course, actually. After the occupation, the Syrian armed forces left in 2005. In 2011, we have a new layer of inhabitation that happened in these villas, and that's of the Syrian refugees that started coming from Syria in 2011. As Mary mentioned, 1.5 million Syrian refugees have entered Lebanon. The numbers, no one knows actually the actual numbers right now. Mostly they have declined a little bit. But with refugees taking refuge in urban areas, a new informal gradual geography of refugee settlement started emerging of what used to be spaces of occupation. The same villa that was occupied by the armed forces become the space for refugees to live in. This geography started emerging in what used to be spaces of occupation, where, for example, in Villa Mkahal, 28 families lived in a structure that was intended for a single family, with an average of 5 people per family. And they came from all over Syria. And for example, I'm going to show you one of the smallest units in Villa Mkahal that became its own apartment for Yasser. And this is like a bedroom, a kitchen, and the bathroom in the same 2x2 apartment. So this is the bathroom, and this is the same table. This is the kitchen, and this is the bed. And Yasser lived there for about 12 years. Their settlement has been facilitated. What was interesting about it that I found out, because I was curious about who allowed these people, how did they end up settling informally in this villa, building these 28 shelters inside one villa. So then I started hearing that the mosque manager, the mosque next door, have actually helped them settle in that villa. So I was also curious about that. So their settlement has been facilitated by manager of the next door mosque, Haj Hashim, who is the manager of the Mkahal mosque, and who apparently have bought the villa and settled the refugees in it. And when I asked why did they settle the refugees informally, and they told me they weren't paying any rent, they started telling me that he was helping them in retaliation of the Syrian occupied forces taking over his villa for many years. No one knows exactly what the story is, but this is the story that was circulated at the time. And so he helped provide them with money, with building material. He was getting international aid for them to help them build these 28 homes inside that one home that was the future of the pre-war future for that structure. And so in talking some of the occupants of the villa, Ahmad, for example, refugee from Hamas, he told me that Haj told us that he had sheltered us here as a retaliation against the Syrian armed forces that had confiscated his villa for 2 decades against his will. And that was when I talked to him in 2018, hinting that the refugees of the villa are sympathetic to the Syrian opposition, at least at the time. And then when I met the Haj himself, I asked him, why did not you develop this land? You're a housing developer. Why didn't you develop the land into an apartment building like the rest of Dawhat Aramun that you saw in the picture? Why settle refugees instead of transforming the villa into a profitable housing development? And then he looked at me and he said, articulating something I didn't expect, a different utopic future of that of the afterlife. So basically he responded and he said, Hiba, not everything is about life transactions. Some transactions need to be done with God, in reference to his work towards banking for his afterlife with the settlement of the refugees. So you don't know if it's about occupation or God, but somewhere in between. Meanwhile, the refugees were not able to articulate a future in Beirut. They kept, when I asked them, talking about what they had in Syria and what they lost and how the conditions that they are living in right now. Meanwhile, while many neighbors overlooking Villa Mkahal, so this is a picture I took from Villa Mkahal, they started not wanting to see the refugees. They started putting up for sale signs around, so many of them, and closed their shutters not to see the refugees, and many of them sold their apartment. What was surprising to me is just before the beginning of the war, and a few months back, I went to continue this project before this fellowship started, only to find that they've been evicted, the whole thing was destroyed, and I couldn't find any trace of the people who lived there or where they went, which is what I'm hoping after the this war ends to figure out. The second housing modality involves an adjacent notorious large-scale, low-cost residential project that I call the Zahra project. Zahra is inhabited by a mix of poor Lebanese families without property titles and more than 200 Syrian refugee families who can only afford to rent there because of the apartment's informal status, a low-cost, run-down, unfinished urban development. Through Zahra, I examined the following processes: the making of the global city, the debris of capitalism, informalization, urban refugees, and the greening of slums. The Zahra project basically is notorious for the heaps of garbage in its alleyways, for its clogged sanitation pipes, and for the myriad skin diseases that plague its children. I've worked a lot in informal settlements since actually my undergraduate. I became interested in squatter settlements, and although I studied architecture, I was always more fascinated by the urbanism and the social and socioeconomic, rather than like the fancy architecture. This is the most I got like scared of going and doing research because of the situation, although I've been to most squatter settlements in Beirut. In Zahra, daily life is shaped by itineraries of displacement and international conflict in Syria, pre-war transnational migrant labor networks, the mandate of international refugee aid organizations that are scrambling to redefine what they're doing, and a refugee population that predominantly resides in mixed urbanized areas. And while the Lebanese children go to the town's public school, most of the Syrian children, many of whom are not registered with UNHCR, are not in school, spending most of their days playing in Zahra's garbage-filled open spaces. And so while I was taking this picture, this wall here is a sewage wall, and the children basically play all day next to these walls of sewage. And I'm gonna play part of the film that Mary introduced.
الناس هذه لو أحوالها منيحة أو قادرة على سكن برا صدقا ما فيها حدا بيسكن هون.
المشروع العباس كله ما حدا بيسكنه.
المي مش متوفرت لهم المي.
المي مو متوفرة عليهم.
مي الغسيل، مي الحمام. قديش أجر البيت هون؟
$200.
شفتي؟ على العظم ولا باب ولا شباك ولا مغسلة.
والشتاء يعني مقبل علينا دحك. لو عندي حيوان ما بحطه هون مشروع العباس.
شو هاي من وين؟ من القسطرات تحت هنا.
من القساطة اللي
ومن تركيت فوق الخامس طابق ادور لهذول المسؤولين وما لقيت والله بدعتك تحكي شلون مسخر.
شايفة؟
بهدله والله.
فوتي
والله يا امي تبهدلنا والله. من فوق يقول هذا بحيرة مقطوع الواير ويمش على كل الجهات.
كم حدا قاعدين بالبيت هون؟
احنا 5 شباب.
طب صاحب الشقة قد ايه عم تدفعوا له بالشهر؟
والله 100 هذا بحيرة مقطوع الواير ويمش على كل الجهات.
ما بعرف.
شنو عايشين
يلا.
نجيل الموت.
قديش اجار هون؟ $200 عم يدفعوا.
يعني على الحيطان ما بيسودوا.
وين صاحب الشقة عايش؟
صاحب الشقة
أو صاحب
بألمانيا وبس عمه هون ياخذ الآجار.
من فوق يقول هذا بحيرة مقطوع الواير ويمش على كل الجهات.
قدموا لكم الامم شيء؟
لا شنو؟
ما قدموا لكم
لا لا.
أولي بس وقفون من زمان.
شو بدي يصير؟
طب والولاد شو بيعمل؟ بيروح على المدرسة؟
والله لا مدرسة. ما كان عندي ابني يدرس بالحريق توفى. وقع من الطاقة الخامس. يعني راح يلعب مع الأولاد. جبته من سوريا صار ضرب هناك جبته من سوريا قلت ما يموت.
So briefly, the different layers that have shaped or allowed for Zahra to emerge the way it is right now is that in 1990, Zahra, like many other similar projects, provided a utopia of suburb. So it was related to the construction of Beirut by Hariri government as a global city before Dubai took that position in the Middle East. So it became projects like Zahra provided a utopia of suburban living for those families who were being gentrified from municipal Beirut. And as post-war reconstruction project of the city aimed to make Beirut a global city, that became unaffordable to its residents. So middle-income families were sold dream apartments in green areas with trees and birds, like Dawhat Aramoun and projects like Zahra, only to realize later that these promises failed as many developers actually defaulted on their payments, and many families found themselves living in vertical informal settlements. And this became the debris of capitalism, and Dawhat Aramoun emerged like one of the pictures that I showed you. And this debris of capitalism, for example, in Zahra, the developers did not finish the buildings. So this is one of them that was developed by the refugees themselves. But then there's also an entire building that they sold and not finished, where I sketched there the building. And so the developer, like Zahra's developer, did not complete the project, no title deeds. This transformed Zahra into informal settlement, the lawsuit against the landowners. Even one of the developers killed one of the landowners in a more dramatic turn of events in this, and allowed the refugees, basically the failure of these plans allowed the possibility for shelter and refugees for many marginalized families that currently live there. And over time, the project has become notorious for what you saw, the garbage, the disease that plagued, and Lebanese rented out to Syrians and moved out for $250, some people paid $250, $300 for what you saw, very basic spaces. And others who cannot afford it were stuck. For example, one of the Lebanese residents told me, in such living conditions, we are more refugees than the Syrian refugees, of course, because of the money that some refugees were getting from the UN that made Lebanese residents more bitter about the situation. And so in 2000, I'm just gonna talk about the International Aid Organization. So in 2015, residents lobbied the United National Higher Council for Refugees to update the project's water and sanitation infrastructure. And so they tried to put pipes. What they did basically is they looked at it and they said they're refugees, they're gonna only be here for 2 and 3 years. So they updated the pipes with 5 centimeters pipes. And we know no refugees go back home in 2 and 3 years. Many stay for all their life. And basically the pipes were clogged again just 3 years afterwards. And the imagined timeline for the UNHCR was basically 2 to 3 years, after which the refugees would return home, which is not the case. So I'll just show the
في الاساطل هون دفناها هلا نحن عملناها ومدفونه. شوفتك اياها؟
ايه هاي اللي مبينه هون.
اهو عملناها.
شو كمان عملتوا؟
عملنا هون كله جديد. هذا كله جديد.
انتوا بايدكم عملتوهم يعني؟ مين عمل؟
ايه بايدنا نحن عملناها. بس هلا نظفنا خلص ما عاد يكتبوا يعني تزمين. اشتغلناهن واشتغلنا كل شيء، بس هي بدها شغل أكثر يعني، بدها بضاعة أفضل، بدها شغل صحية أفضل. غيرنا في سبيل، بس اللي راكب قديم عم يفك هلا، عم ينتزع هلا.
بتعرف لما جينا السنة الماضية حسيتك كنت كثير متفائل أكثر.
بقول لك صراحة يعني اللبنانيين ما بخلونا نشتغل. يعني اليوم أنا مستأجر، بيجي بصلح لصاحب الشقة بتقول له تعال اخصم لي يا أخي، ما بيخصم. ما فيها.
So basically, some of the initial thoughts about this project, I don't feel it's the time to theorize this work. It's been very hard to do any of that, but some of initial thoughts about this project. So in the case of Beirut, while providing basic shelter for many, these spaces of poverty have become contested terrains not only along sectarian lines, but most importantly along national lines, fueling xenophobia towards refugees, channeled through discourses not only around national and urban citizenship, but also about materiality of space, over broken pipes, over garbage disposal, overflowing sewage. And sedimentary urbanization projects therefore excavate these intertwined layers to figure out the honeycomb of the local, international, and national jurisdictions that basically leave Zahra, projects like Zahra, outside of any networks of support or help or governance. And keeping in mind that this is a work in progress, the way I'm thinking about it is the following: that sedimentation is a process of settling that's the result of multiple processes that move across space and time. And basically, what about these new geographies that emerge through these different spatial segmentation projects? How can we think of the destination spaces? And again, I'm not romanticizing, as you can see, the kind of spaces that have emerged, but to think with them about what is it that emerges after the futures die and new future, like it doesn't end, new things emerge. And so what are the kind of spaces that emerge in the wake of these new geographies of the dead futures? However, the problem is in places like Lebanon and in cities in Beirut, one does not have the luxury of studying a site for a long time before violence hits again, because soon after a new round of violence is going to happen, destruction is going to hit again. That has been my life, that has been the life of many Lebanese people. And this is exactly what is happening right now in Lebanon, as these sites take a new turn as we watch Israel bomb Lebanon, annihilate southern suburbs of Beirut, including Sahra Shwaifet, Hay Madi, Aramun, and many of the research sites you saw here. And so here is a quick look, and I told you at some point to remember an image, so I'm going to show you this short video. This is from a news website. This is the housing project I just showed you a picture. So basically what you see here, this is the real distraction of one of my research sites, of the people I spent 15 years studying, of the spaces I spent, I'm going to try not to cry, I spent decades reading. And so the question becomes, how does a researcher, how does an academic, how does an activist, how does anyone study war or its geographies if this is the situation. And as another war has arrived and with yet another round of mass displacement, so right now I was looking at the numbers, there's estimated over 1 million people have been displaced in Lebanon, including Lebanese citizens, migrant workers, Syrian refugees, Palestinian refugees. And as Lebanon awaits another round of maybe reconstruction, my question becomes about whether in cities like Beirut, do we even have the time to think about the geographies of that future, of what might emerge as a hopeful situation, or whether we remain always thinking about the futures of the geographies of the dead? Thank you.
Thank you so much. There's just so much happening here. I just have a very simple question about, I think what's a really remarkable concept you're working through with futures. So much of this idea of futures is about the speculative, and so much of utopian thought is also speculative. But then also we are seeing so much of this driven by different kinds of capitalist ideas of futures, as trading futures, as speculative market futures. And so much has been so blatantly and vulgarly said about what are we going to do with these geographies. There can be some real estate speculation, and we can rezone these things for XYZ peoples. So how does one think between these two ideas of futures and these two ways of thinking speculation with two very different political and financial meanings?
Yeah, thank you so much. This is a great question. Of course, as your question implies, you cannot separate the futures of capitalism and what capitalism wants, including militarization, including the selling of weapons, from. So while we want to trick ourselves to thinking that the future, if we manage it, and we're all working towards development and progress, at the same time, there's all this development of nuclear weapons and of militarization that ensure that the future for some is not going to be that, because the weapons are going to be sold, someone is going to use it, and are going to use it at people. So it's very hypocritical anyways. Capitalism itself has in itself, and of course the destruction itself is part of capitalism, because then right now, I was 2 years ago, I was invited to speak about in conversation with people about the Ukraine. And it was fascinating to me because you immediately had these fancy architects ready, like with their plans, like right now, you know, like Ram Koolhaas, etc., like Norman Foster. They have the plans ready right now. And then, of course, so this is one form in which there are people ready to, we're going to make it better, right? Just to trust us, although we know that we can't trust these people because money, it's basically for the rich, like post-war, that the reconstruction of Beirut itself. But at the same time, you have a different kind, or maybe similar, related, the kind that you're seeing in Gaza and in Beirut, where immediately, one of the most surreal moments I had before I came to this fellowship, I don't watch much of TV, but I opened Hulu, and you know how the one with ads. And then the first thing, you think Gaza is like that? Look what we can make Gaza. And then it's all like these villas and people at the beach. And I was like, I can't believe there was just like massacres right now. I was watching on Al Jazeera, you turn to Hulu and someone is giving you only if you buy in our politics in the world, only if you don't resist, only if you're okay with colonizing, we can ensure you can have our future, which is villas and beaches and etc. So I think the two are intertwined. And in Lebanon, the same thing. Last week, 2 weeks ago, I'm sure many of you have seen these websites where oh, look, we're going to reconstruct it. We're going to make it we're going to expand Israel to this part of the world, and this is the villas. This is where what you can have only if you can move, be with us. And so I think these two things are interlinked, and somehow capitalism wants us all to imagine as one future, which is a future in which you can consume and not resist and be okay with the Western domination of what their ideas of the future is. And this is what we're seeing right now in many ways. So the colonial project is also part of a capitalist project that is of white colonization. But it's also not, although it's hard to speak about how these geographies are unique, and like Beirut, if they want to make a joke in Homeland or any of these TV series, it's oh, this is Beirut, oh my God, this is this crazy place. Afro-pessimism is again black folks all over the world are also dealing with a similar situation in which the futures for them are always foreclosed. it's based on them that people get get exploited, they get killed, they get shot in the name of security. And so it's not only people in Lebanon or Gaza that are experiencing these futures. They're black folks, they're LGBT folks, many the trans folks that where the future for them is foreclosed, but they are not part of the imagined future of progress that is of white colonial capitalist futures that are trying to dominate the world.
Thank you for this really incredible talk. I learned a lot, so thank you. I think I'm kind of interested in the affective dimension, especially of the point that you just were ending on with the last question of sort of what the affective dimension of the foreclosed future looks like or feels like. Because I was really interested in, as you were talking about your first project, the way that the architecture of dead futures confuses all of these binaries that we normally think of as distinct, war and peace, building and destruction, things like that. And so I just would be curious to hear you say more about what the affective aspect of that might look like. A confusion of hope and despair, for example, right? Or if that's not the right way to think about the distinction.
No, thank you. This is a great question. And I mean, it's interesting because I feel like for many people in the world, they're not aware. If you're born on the right side of the border, if you're born in the right skin color, you are not actually aware of how the ways in which other people experience futures, in which black people, in which Palestinian and in which African folks experience the future. Because, for example, I'm going to speak as a Lebanese, not to impose my idea. You can never be sure of the future. Whereas when I moved to the US, I mean, people were like, do you want to buy this ticket for this concert that's 7 months from now? I was like, what? No, I didn't grow up like that. I can buy a concert ticket for tonight, but maybe tomorrow. That's it, you know. 7 months from now, that doesn't exist. And so many people don't know this, how the rest of the world live futures. So black folks, I know from my friends who are raising, especially boys in the US, they have to talk to their boys about like how to be a black man in the US, how you always have to expect violence against you. And so most people in the world actually live in that kind of uncertain, affective of future that is not guaranteed. But the people who rule the world they don't experience that future for the most part. So I think as a person, like, the interesting thing is that I'm getting like requests from media, this like, your book For the War Yet to Come expected the war to come. I was like, no. It's an ethnographic work. It's people expecting the war all the time to come. And even if this war ends, and hopefully it will end, there's another war. People are going to keep expecting the war because this is how the life you lived. And so this is the effective kind of future, that the future can go in the right way, but most likely it won't, or it's more cyclical and it's not a linear idea of progress.
When I was in Beirut the first time in 1995, there was a symbol of the ruins of the destruction. It was the La Maison Jaune, who was exactly, if you remember, on the middle of the street and the old city. And they were really imagining that home could stay exactly as on the ruin for a symbol of the past. And finally, after the destruction of the 4th of August and all the project of reconstruction of the city, what happened finally with, because how is finally the symbol of rebuilding a city, even having the traces, the memories of so many destructions and the past so tragic?
Thank you. So I think you're referring to the billboards that they were putting around downtown about what they call the ancient city of the future. I think that was the logo of Solidaire at the time. But they only wanted a certain kind of history, the history that is celebrated by visitors, the Roman history, maybe a little bit the Ottoman history, but not the history of the Civil War. So actually there was a big conversation in Lebanon, and one side decisively won, which is, what do you do with the Civil War? Do you actually commemorate the Civil War? Is that part of your history? And no, that's not part of it. We're going to have to erase it. And so many of the traces of the Civil War have been erased completely, but there's only one kind of history that was going to be the ancient city of the future, which is of the Roman ruins. and some of the Ottoman mosques in downtown Beirut. So it's interesting that you said that. It's just they were. So we want history, but it's only a very specific, celebrated kind of history. We don't want to acknowledge other histories. And actually, Lebanon is one of the countries that had a civil war and never had what they call them. Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So we woke up one day. I was a child, teenager, and they're like, "War's ended. Now you can go on with your life." And they're like, "Okay, let's go back to school." No one talked about it. We never talked about it. No one knew who killed who. Sometimes people come out in documentaries and talk about their regrets, but no, we actually never dealt with it, and it keeps repeating in different forms.
Thank you. I'm struck by the questions turning to the future, and I want, following the last moment, to turn a little to the past. I was very struck at the beginning by your gesture to the autobiographical and to moments in your talk when you said, "This is where I lived. This is how long I lived there," and also your use of sedimentary as a methodological lens. You said, if you're willing, I'd love to hear more about how doing this process. Are there moments where you come in contact with the wisdom or insight or memory of your past self? You know, maybe if you're able to sift through this sediment of the wisdom of your adolescent and so.
Yeah,
what are the
thank
things
you.
that connect to this research now?
Thank you. I mean, I do believe, and I tell my students that it's my personal belief that every research question, if you dig deep enough, it's a personal question. Even if you want to know about transportation, like even if you come to Paris, like there is a reason if you dig deep enough. And initially when I was doing my research, and this research did not start about war and displacement, although we were as a family displaced 6 times, but because it was never articulated as displacement, it was never articulated as refugees. Like like my parents did not talk about that in that way. So I was actually not self-aware of that. And that project, the whole project started in Sahra Shweifet that was just destroyed right now. That's why I've conducted research longest there. And I was just looking into some random question when I went to study for my master's in the US, which is like why certain apartments are vacant and other not, like seemingly like a political question. Let's see, they leave it as a dowry, you know, like the Western idea. They left it as a dowry for their daughters. That's what it is. That's in Egypt, not in Lebanon. But anyway, so I was like curious about that. And only when I went there, and as a young person, no one told me how do you research these things? Like you can't knock on doors. It's just the end of the Civil War, like just 10 years earlier. Like, so I was like just thrown in the field, and slowly started talking to people in these areas, only to realize that no one left it as a dowry or anything. It's actually empty only during the day. And the reason is they were all war displaced in areas like Haimadi, the buildings I showed you where people lived inside them. And they were waiting for $5,000 that was going to give as a war compensation to move to their new apartments. But they couldn't move because they would lose the $5,000. Some got more, to $20,000, etc. And so they were basically continuing to living in displacement in these places in Haimadi, waiting for that little bit of money to be moved to their apartments that they bought on the outskirts in the cheaper areas. So that empty spaces were actually not empty. There was a long story of war and displacement in it. And only when I started learning that my question about empty houses and potentially dowries and ended up, I was like war, displacement, it's only then I started doing self-reflection. And I decided to come out eventually and have one chapter in my book about where I live. And it became a self-ethnographic work in which I had to do it. When I wrote it, my family was scared because some information can get you in trouble. And eventually I had to read the chapter with my mother and eliminate all the sentences and the pictures that she felt they would put them in trouble. And this is the kind of, eventually I had to come with the history and the fears and how we live next to the Syrian army ourselves, and what we were projected to, and our own displacement, how we ended in the suburbs of the city through that kind of excavation. So in some sense, the scholarly project allowed me to do a personal reconstruction of my own personal narrative, not only the other way around, not using only my personal narrative for research, because in some ways I wasn't aware of that, or I wasn't made aware of that history of mine. I never thought of myself as a war-displaced person until that project.
Thank you, Hiba. I very much enjoyed the the field work you were doing and showing in details the daily life of people suffering under these conditions. While you were talking, I was having this thought all the time that actually the situation right now has changed drastically into something else completely of no future. Meaning a continuous war. That the war that started a year ago is not something that will stop anytime. And if you read the Israeli newspapers, which I do from time to time, and the analysis that you can find there, that these places like Gaza and next South Lebanon will not exist anymore as places for living. So this poses really a new questions for us as researchers, as artists, as filmmakers, as human beings. What can we do in these circumstances where actually our research or our films or our work of art has less and less meaning because there's no future? So a place like Gaza today, I mean, there's no way that this war will end because actually the place itself is unlivable. And the same practice will be done in Lebanon, it seems. And then there is, of course, ideas of expansions of the Israeli empire, meaning that we can change borders. There is no international law. There is no rules. In the name of security, in the name of self-defense, you can do anything. So really, my feeling is that we are entering a new phase, quite, I would say, apocalyptic, in a sense that will change the world.
I mean, I hear you. I don't. I mean, I have so many thoughts. One major thought is the no future is a future, i.e., the no future for Gazans and the no future, quote unquote, for Lebanese is a future for Israel, and so the future is always someone's future. There is no future. So someone is benefiting from the future of other people's no future or bad, dark future. So that's one thing. The other thing no one knows, I mean, I have so many things. One thing is I was watching, just to make light of the very heavy situation a little bit, I'm watching this Instagram videos of Lebanese kids asking ChatGPT about what's going to happen in the war and what ChatGPT, OpenIA, Perplexity is telling them. And they're posting them like, oh, ChatGPT is expecting that the war is going to end in 2028. And then like, no, my ChatGPT is expecting that the war is going to end next year. So this kind of anxiety is basically like, maybe, Marty, artificial intelligence will tell us when it's going to end, so we know. So I don't think anyone knows what's going to happen or how it's going to future is going to be born. But what disturbs me a lot is when I teach in a US classroom, I ask the students if they think they're at war. Like I ask American students, most of my students are American at Columbia University, and they don't think they're at war. They're like, what? Why are we at war? I was like, do you know that there are wars like for your safety, in your name for your safety? Do you know that like 100,000 people at least were killed in Iraq in the name of your safety by a lie? Do you know this is being done in your name? Do you know that you're at war? Nothing. And so I feel like for many people in the world, the war is done in their name. The war is done by their taxes. The weapons are, but they think that they're so peaceful, they have a peaceful life, and that the war is just some monsters somewhere else that are doing war, and that they had. And this is what drives me crazy: is that you guys, you have to know that you are creating war for others while you are in your suburban picketed fence and going to Columbia University. But there's like so much that goes into the construction of a discourse that you are not part of this war, that you are living a peaceful. You are peaceful. These Middle Easterns are monsters. These people in African cities, they don't want to be developed or civilized, rather than we are doing that to them, and it's in that money. And that's also for the Israeli case, and that's what hurts the most. And I feel, when I was wondering why am I teaching in the US and not teaching in Lebanon, or at some point I was having a crisis doing this work, I was like, why am I not teaching these kids? They don't know alphabets, they don't know numbers. I was like, what am I doing? And I was like, maybe the only silver lining for this is that every day I walk into class, I was like, do you know you guys are at war? Do you know that the war is done in your name? You think you're in safety, but you are causing, I mean, I don't know what our role is, frankly, but at least teaching is one, I think. But I don't have better answers, sorry.
I was very surprised when I was working with, doing a refugee project some years ago, to learn that the UK government has an actual policy. It's the first law that Boris Johnson signed when he became Prime Minister of the UK, which is a loan agreement to countries in the developing world where they're given interest-free loans, and if they can't pay it back, they can immediately, then they can buy weapons from the UK government in lieu of paying back the money, they can just get free weapons. And this way the UK government can get rid of the old weapons that they can't sell to richer countries. And I think that part of your thing is people need to be more educated and to learn to look actually quite closely at how they're voting, and people don't. Do you think that that your job at Columbia is actually helping people to consider their vote more judiciously? Do you think it's just like because you're literally in the position of the person who
I have
can
that power.
Yeah.
I don't have that power.
No, but who does?
It's more powerful than me.
Yeah. No, but
in that space.
But we were at this talk this morning at the Louvre, and the Louvre, they were having this whole discourse about the academic presentation of art and this and that. But actually, art and education and university and you doing this work does seem to have quite a sort of strong political clout if you use it as you are doing so judiciously.
I mean, this is an important question. I mean, I'm joking as like, I mean, yeah, maybe changing, I mean, what, biggest class I've taught 80 people, I don't know, maybe, but that's only 80 people. What troubles me sometimes is this kind of work falls on the back of the people who are already lived it, or they are already disadvantaged by it. So it ends up being the role of, I mean, I'm privileged still, but the role of people that come from these places to educate, and then to like, we're here, listen to us, please, we're here, please, can you like just threaten not to vote until they stop, just threaten not to vote until they stop weapons. You can vote, but just threaten for 60 days, say we will not vote if you don't. No one is willing to do that. No, you want to get Trump? I was like, no, I don't want to get Trump, but just like see us. And so it falls on the shoulders of the already disadvantaged, and already the black people and the trans people and all these people who are living this cyclical time to educate others. And sometimes we're too exhausted, and I hope I'm changing people's mind, but what? Like, how many people are in this room? We're having this conversation. It doesn't reach far, you know? And I don't know, I'm dystopic about these situations, but I do think education in general, mass education of these things does change the mind. But right now, I'm in a pessimist. I'm always in somehow pessimistic mood about the world, but this is what I feel right now. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Which are always in some way future-oriented. How? I mean, it seems. And again, I recognize the difficulty of asking any of these questions at this particular juncture, especially when we see that perhaps the cycle will be broken, and rather than a cycle of war and something as similar to peace and war again, we will just have permanent war. But nonetheless, we are also architects and planners, and it seems like the work, this kind of study of how people actually make their built environments, how they deal with the failure of planning, how they make their own temporary solutions to that, does have something to tell planners and architects about. I gather that's where it started for you, although it's now kind of wrapped up in a lot of more difficult issues. So I imagine it's going to be part of your life's work, but what does this tell you, or how do you speak to students? How do you think about planning when you can't think about future in the same, when you are wisely not thinking about future as a kind of linear, teleological, optimistic thing?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. I don't have the answer to that, but I do have one answer, which is I think it's our collective, it's imperative on all of us who are educated in that linear, focused, like planning, like architecture, like the ones that sell you. I went to MIT, I went to Berkeley, I went to all these places, and they sell you the same future, that you are just making the future better, only to realize that's not the life that you lived. And then they're like, what are you talking, the cognitive dissonance that you have at some point. And so it's on all of us to figure out what does planning look like if we don't all take on this very colonial, capitalist, non-realistic for most of the world's future. What does it look like? I don't have personally the answer, but what I call for answer, because every time you teach in the classroom, especially if you're teaching master students who are there to get a degree and go get a job, is basically they want hope. They're like, okay, this is too dark. Can you just give us hopeful stories? I'm like, try. I don't know. Four moms took over one house in Oakland as a I don't know, to stop foreclosure. It's something, but these guys put pipes for themselves. I don't know. That's the hope. I don't know if there is a major hope that is like can challenge that idea of the future, but to present a better future. But I do believe that we need to work. What does a post-colonial, or if you want a decolonial kind of hope looks like? That hope that is not the kind of hope that we are very much invested right now, is that, or that we collectively consume, which is that you just improve, like the one I talked about. But what does it mean if we collectively need to get somewhere else, to get in a better place, rather than just some of us getting to one place and not the others? What would a hope that is not invested in that teleological idea of the future, that is more about connections in the world and seeing the other look like? Can we then think about planning and architecture in a post-colonial form of hope? Because right now, I also want to go back to the example of the US that is easier for more people around blackness, is that the hope that is the hope that is invested in most things is a hope very much steeped in whiteness. And for most black folks, they talk about, I love that literature, as you can imagine, that talks about how in order for whiteness to flourish, black bodies or black people have to be exposed to their life or their life taken away. And therefore, someone's hope or someone's better future is very much rooted in the taking of life or the bare lifeness of other kind of population. And you can take it on different cases. Is there another way that this hope does not necessitate, or some people's hope does not necessitate taking away the life or the living? Or like one woman said in this video, she said that we're just, the literal translation, which is, we're living because of the shortage of death. We're living because of the shortage of death. That death did not come to us yet, and therefore that's why we're still alive. Is there a way we can imagine hope and the future in a different way? I don't have the answer, but this is what I'm thinking about.
Thank you. I think we don't have time for any more questions, but thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for coming.